Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and welcome back to another session on my Declassified Caribbean. Now, this afternoon, we are exploring a fascinating and often misunderstood question. Are Caribbean and African people one people? Race, identity, and history. This is a discussion that deserves careful thought because identity is shaped by more than ancestry alone. There is little dispute that millions of Caribbean people are descended from Africans who were forcibly brought across the Atlantic during the transatlantic slave trade. Now, that is something that we cannot deny. That shared ancestry has left an undeniable imprint on our music, religion, language, cuisine, family structures, folklore, and ways of seeing the world. The African contribution to the Caribbean civilization or to Caribbean civilization is immense and cannot be overstated. But ancestry and identity are not always identical. Over 400 years, the Caribbean developed into a civilization of its own. African traditions merged with European institutions, indigenous influences, and later the cultures of Indians, Chinese, Syrians, Lebanese, Portuguese, and others. The result is a distinctly Caribbean identity that is rooted in Africa, but not identical to any single African culture. This distinction has been recognized by several Caribbean thinkers. The Barbadian historian Hilary Beckles has argued that the Caribbean is fundamentally a product of the African diaspora, while also emphasizing that Caribbean societies created new cultures and under the extraordinary conditions of slavery and colonialism. In other words, the Caribbean inherited Africa, but also transformed that inheritance into something uniquely Caribbean. The Trinidadian historian Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery demonstrated how the Caribbean experience was shaped not simply by Africa, but by the economic and political forces of European colonialism. The Caribbean became a new historical space where African peoples forged new identities under entirely different circumstances. Similarly, the Martinican poet and philosopher Aimé Césaire, one of the founders of the Negritude movement, celebrated African heritage while insisting that Caribbean peoples should embrace their own historical experience rather than merely attempt to recreate Africa. The Jamaican scholar Rex Netterford perhaps expressed it more clearly. He argued that Caribbean identity is neither African, nor European, nor Asian in isolation. Rather, it is a creative synthesis born from the meeting and often the collision of multiple civilizations. Africa remains central to that identity, but Caribbean culture evolved into something distinctive. The perspective is also reflected in the work of the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, who maintained that the African heritage of Caribbean people is indispensable to understanding the region, while recognizing that centuries of life in the Americas produced societies that cannot simply be equated with those on the African continent. So this afternoon, we're asking an important question. And that is something that we have to reflect on. Can two peoples share ancestry without sharing the same cultural identity? Can Caribbean people honor their African roots while acknowledging that they have become a distinct civilization in their own right? These are not questions of superiority or inferiority. They are questions of history, identity, and truth. Throughout this program, we'll examine the historical evidence, the writings of Caribbean intellectuals, and the evolution of Caribbean society to better understand where similarities and where differences begin. Join us in this discussion. Keep your comments respectful, support your views with evidence where possible, and let's explore one of the most important questions about who we are as Caribbean people. You're watching Declassified Caribbean live. Okay, let's connect the dots. Now, let's begin with Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy are among the most influential scholars on diaspora identity and Black Atlantic culture. While they did not generally say Caribbean people are not Africans in those words, they made arguments that are directly relevant to our discussion. And this is what they're saying. And we have Stuart Hall, and he was of Jamaican descent, was born in Jamaica, and he studied in England and lived there throughout his professional life. And Stuart Hall is one of the most recognized sociologists in the world. Now, this is what he says. Cultural identities come from somewhere, have histories, but like everything which is historical, they undergo constant transformation. So one identity can evolve and does evolve and does not remain static. And that is what we yearn for, even within our own personal lives. You might remember your time growing up as a young Trinidadian or a young Jamaican, wherever you're coming from. But time does not remain static. It evolves. So the Jamaica of yesteryear is not the same Jamaica that you had in the 1960s. And sometimes we have to move as people, and we just don't like to move on. We like to reminisce, and we like to remain in the past, right? Because we think the past is our life, because that is where we lived, right? And that is the times that probably we preferred. Now, this is one of Hall's most cited statements. His point is that Caribbean identity has African origins, but it has been transformed through history rather than remaining unchanged. Another important passage, and I quote from him, far from being externally fixed in some essentialized past, they are subject to the continuous play of history, culture, and power. So Hall rejected the idea that there is a single unchanging African identity shared by all people of African descent. Instead, Caribbean identity is something continually shaped by historical experience. And history is what we live every day. By the way, some of you think history is yesteryear, but history is what we live every day, and history is never static. He also described Caribbean identity as being produced through diaspora, right? Displacement, slavery, and creolization, rather than simply being an extension of Africa. So we have from the Black Atlantic, modernity, and double consciousness, Gilroy argued that Black identities cannot be understood solely through the nation state or through Africa itself. Instead, he introduced the concept of the Black Atlantic, a transatlantic culture created through the movements of people, ideas, music, and political thought between Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and the Americas. One widely quoted statement from him is, and I quote, "The image of ships in modern motion across the spaces between Europe, America, and Africa and the Caribbean focuses attention on the Middle Passage. The ship symbolizes the creation of new identities rather than the preservation of a single African culture." And this was what Paul Gilroy suggested. Now, the Black Atlantic can be defined as one single complex unit of analysis. His argument is that African-descended peoples developed interconnected but distinct cultures across the Atlantic world. Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Haiti, Nigeria, Ghana, Britain, and the United States are linked through the shared history, yet each developed its own identity. How these ideas fit our discussion this afternoon, that is what we are about to explore. Caribbean people are overwhelmingly of African descent, and let us be very clear on that. But Caribbean identity is not identical to African identity. It is a diasporic identity shaped by African heritage, slavery, colonialism, colonization, and centuries of historical development in the Caribbean. And that is why we're called Creoles, right? And go and research the meaning of the word Creoles, Los Criollos, as they would say in Spanish. Now, that position is broadly consistent with the work of Rex Netterford, Kamau Brathwaite, and we have Edward Glissant, all of whom emphasized that Caribbean civilization emerged from African roots while becoming something historically and culturally distinct. For many people in the Caribbean, the shared experience of the transatlantic slave trade has become the dominant lens through which African ancestry is understood, because the majority of the enslaved people, or this enslaved people, brought to many Caribbean islands came from the West and West Central Africa, right? So many of us came from that region of Africa. African often functions as a broad ancestral identity rather than a reference to a specific ethnicity, language, or nation. However, Africa is extraordinarily diverse. It is home to thousands of ethnic groups, over 2,000 languages, and a wide range of cultures, religions, and histories. A Yoruba person from present-day Nigeria, an Akan person from Ghana, a Congo person from Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, an Amhara from Ethiopia, a Berber from Amazing and from North Africa, and a Zulu from South Africa still have distinct historical and cultural identities. Referring to all of these peoples simply as Africans can obscure those differences. The Caribbean adds another layer of complexity. Over generations, enslaved Africans and their descendants developed new identities through interaction with European, indigenous, Indian, Chinese, Middle Eastern, and other populations. As a result, many scholars argue that being Caribbean is not the same as being culturally African, even though there are clear African influences in language, music, religion, cuisine, and social practices. This is a point that Caribbean intellectuals have explored in different ways. Stuart Hall, for example, argued that Caribbean identity is culturally formed and transformed through history, migration, and cultural exchange, rather than being simply a continuation of African identities. Paul Gilroy's concept of the Black Atlantic similarly emphasizes the creation of new transatlantic Black cultures that are related to Africa but are not identical to any one African culture. So let's begin to define these terminologies. How do we distinguish between ancestry, ethnicity, nationality, cultural identity? Let us just define these terminologies, because oftentimes we conflate them and we confuse ourselves. Ancestry refers to where one's forebears came from, and the majority of the Caribbean forebears, their ancestors, came from Africa, and that is undeniable, right? That's an undeniable, irrefutable fact. Now, the word ethnicity refers to a specific cultural and historical community. Example, Yoruba, Igbo, or Akan. Nationality refers to citizenship. Example, are you Jamaican, Trinidadian, Barbadian, wherever you're from, right? The country that you were born in, or you might have adopted, okay? Cultural identity refers to the traditions, values, and lived experiences that shape a person's sense of self. So a lived experience, a Jamaican lived experience, is not synonymous with an African, Nigerian, whatever continent it may come from, is not even similar to a Black American lived experience. And that is why we have so much problems and divisions in the world, because we want to assume that we all have shared experiences, and that's not true. Now, we can say that the African slave trade was something synonymous, and colonialism and other isms that we have endured. But at the same time, we can't suggest that we are all equal in terms of our lived experiences. And I've often seen Black people who go to Jamaica, go to other parts of the world, and they understand that we're all not the same. We look the same because our ancestors came from Africa, but our lived experiences and our identities are not the same. And this is what we are here to discuss, because culture is the way of life of a people. And we know that there are different things that shape culture: the language, the histories, right? The people's way of life, religion, foods, and we don't all do the same and share the same religious values and foods and cuisines. Now, a Jamaican of African descent, for example, may have African ancestry while identifying culturally as Jamaican or Caribbean. That identity is neither less African nor simply African. It reflects a distinct historical and cultural development in the Caribbean. This is one of the central debates in Caribbean studies: how to recognize the profound influence of African heritage while also acknowledging that Caribbean societies developed their own identities. Okay? And this is very important that we understand. The Caribbean peoples developed their own identities, and nothing is wrong with that. That is the underlying characteristic of being a human, right? Even the diaspora develops their own beings and identities. So the Trinidadian diaspora in the UK or in the United States might not be the same as in the homeland in Trinidad. And that's okay, because culture evolves the same way in which Trinidad celebrates. So the people in the Trinidad and the diaspora celebrates the carnival in New York or in Toronto or in anywhere in the world where they are, where you have a solid Trinidadian diaspora. It does not mean, therefore, because they are different and they might not like some of our foods, or they might eat, something different or something merged, does not make them less Trinidadian, though their ancestors are from Trinidad. And that is what we have to understand. And sometimes we go abroad and we are, oh, why aren't you eating oxtail? Why aren't you eating pilau? And all of these things. It doesn't mean that because they don't eat those foods, make them less of a Trinidadian or make their ancestors less of a Trinidadian. All right, because when they're now living in that culture, where whatever culture that they might have adopted, right, they have to survive within that culture, and that's what makes them and humans, right? Humans are not static. And I see that this black-white dichotomy has made us into static beings. And when people say that they're white or they're black, it's vague. They don't know what they mean. So we have lots of confusion. And this is what we have to understand. Because we're neither black nor white. Even in the United States, nobody is neither black nor white. But that is how we have been acculturated through miseducation. Through miseducation, as Carter Woodson would have said, of the black person. And the American, all of us are miseducated. And that's why we have to now begin to re-educate ourselves. Now, that perspective is reflected in the work of scholars such as Stuart Hall, Rex Netterford, Edward Kamau Brathwaite, and others, though they differ in how they describe the relationship between Africa and the Caribbean. Now, let's listen to a brief clipping from Rex Netterford, who was giving, whilst he was alive, a seminar. He made a very important speech at the University, I believe, of Birmingham. So we're going to listen to what he says about the Caribbean, what his understanding of multiculturalism is all about, and then we will come back. We will circle back and begin to have be an interesting conversation. So let me share my screen with you and get you to understand. I know you're not going to be willing to hear some of these intellectuals, some of you, because you're so much brainwashed that you can't leave that. You want to remain in that black-white sort of dichotomy, which makes you very, very limited in scope. Now, let's get this thing on the screen, and then we will listen to what he's saying and try to understand, because a lot of times it's the lack of understanding which causes us to hold on to ignorance. So let me turn on top the back volume on what Professor Rex Netterford is saying.
In Europe, only 10 days ago, and I was spending euros. The region level, rather subliminal level, understands that trades on the unity which underlie the differences. The unity is said to be submarine by one of our West Indian poets, Kamau Brathwaite, and a region of limestone and volcanic rocks separated by divisive seawater. One can understand the metaphor and grasp the difficulties in transforming the creative diversity of floating island spaces, colonial historical experiences, and language differences into an integrated whole expressed in a common humanity. Admittedly, The eloquence of the differences is powerful. We continue to speak of the region of some 30 million people as Hispanic Caribbean, the Anglophone Caribbean, the Francophone Caribbean, the Dutch-speaking Caribbean, and so on. Such hyphenated fragmentation emphasizes the legacy of a heritage of separation and shattered identities. Yet none of this has deprived us in our separate dispensations of that awesome process of becoming. Our people were able to survive the traumas of separation from ancestral hearths as part of the transatlantic slave trade and the indignity of dehumanization in slavery, for the vast majority by the exercise of their creative imagination. What results from this has been the germ of a culture which shares more in common than many like to believe. The products may differ one from another, but the region shares a similar process of becoming. And this is very obvious. CARICOM is finding that Cuba is certainly trying to get in there. Haiti is a member of CARICOM. San Domingo is an observer, as Cuba is. Suriname, which is Caribbean, has also joined. And even Brazil, because northern Brazil is very Caribbean, Bahia. And the Caribbean music and what have is very popular there, and so on. So people do have a sense of that underlying unity through the products of the exercise of the creative imagination. Culture, then, as a point of power, and the recognition of this by these Caribbean dependencies catapult them into the 21st century precisely because they are in possession of that new sensibility forged over 500 years of encounters, making them fully au fait with relationships, with text, in diversity, all together, and that really is the challenge of any culturally diverse entity. And this is the creativity that has to inform it. The old Spanish Empire hankered after this, as did the Romans before them, with their e pluribus unum motto. But you can still declare the motto and not realize unum out pluribus. If you don't have Latin, well, the Jamaicans made sure that they translated it, and their motto is out of many, one people. Of course, in Jamaica, you often, it depends who is speaking. Who is speaking, if you have a sense of power there already, you might be saying, out of many, one people. If you don't, you are likely to say, out of many, one people, and so on. Very complex. Even that we have had to deal with and are dealing with it. Today, there are parts of the world, and especially of this hemisphere, that celebrate their newfound perception in something called multiculturalism. I regard this as a piece of jargon we must be very careful of. Why? Somebody in Leicester the other night misunderstood me. But this is what I mean. The multi could well speak to a pluralism which secures for each ingredient in the mix an unassailable corner of exclusivity. So you stay in your small corner and I in mine. And if I am the powerful one, that means even more. You stay over there. I admit you are here. But I want to be here and want to have my position, which is the position of the corner of control. So one has to watch this very carefully. Vidya Naipaul recently came out very strongly. He took a line slightly different from myself. He typically Naipaul, he said, look, after all, you people have come here. What is all this nonsense about multiculturalism? You have come here, you come to the people's country, you must become the people. I don't believe that. I believe that as soon as there is an encounter, both start to influence each other and both change. And as I have repeatedly said since coming to Birmingham, I have often said to my white audiences in the United States of America, as soon as you can come to terms with the notion that you are as negrified as I am Europeanized, then we are in business. That has, in fact, made it very difficult for some people. But in fact, multiculturalism can leave the gaping gaps between cultures that are in encounter and not changing anything. Because the thing is the relationship. That is what you determine the dynamics, the true dynamics of the situation.
All right, so I think that he has said enough, and I think that he was very clear in what he was bringing across to us in for this afternoon's program. But I think one of the clear statements that he made was the fact that we need to understand as civilizations come together, as they're merged together, whether it's through force or through a free volition, right? Their decision to do that, to migrate to a particular region. Once civilizations and cultures come together, they are going to impact each other. And as he suggested, that he wants his white people to understand that once they begin to know that the black person has been Europeanized as just as they have been negrified, then we can have a conversation. But to suggest that we are just in a box by ourselves and that we never had any contact, any influence on the other, then something is wrong, because that is not human. That's not the way humans interact. As I'm suggesting here, even our Caribbean cultures, wherever we're found, whether it's in the United States or it's in Canada or it's in the UK, that it goes through an evolutionary process in which people adopt whatever culture that they find themselves in. So whether it is trying to be white, you find even in black culture in the United States, and some of us who have lived there for long enough, you find that even when our Caribbean folks and black folks, black Americans, begin to work with predominantly white people, that they take on some of their, sometimes in a very inadvertent manner, they don't even realize that they take on some of their characteristics, right? The way how they communicate, the way how they socialize, right? Their values. You can see that, and sometimes it's not necessarily noticeable by the person who is within that culture, but that is the way how humans adopt, right? We have to adapt, rather, not adopt, but adapt. We have to adapt wherever we find our environments. And certainly in the Caribbean here, all the cultures that came together, we might not have liked each other and perhaps continue to not like each other. But the fact of the matter is that we have to adapt if we are going to live in this environment. Something else that Professor Rex Ediford suggested in his video, in his speech, is the fact that as Caribbean people, we live side by side, but not necessarily together. I think that is a very important point for us to understand, because yes, in the States too, people live side by side, but they don't live together. So I can live in your neighborhood, right? And we live side by side and we're neighbors, but we don't necessarily share any sort of commonality, any sort of values. And this is what we have learned to have done in the Caribbean. We're not segregated, but we are not also living together. Will we ever live together? That's another question that is debatable, and we have to have that for another live. But let's begin to greet you now, and some of you, good evening, Marie. Thank you. Welcome to the live. And we have WHZ saying, correct, Caribbean is overwhelmingly of African descent, but unique and diverse ethnicities and cultures. Yes, and that is what makes us Caribbean. Now, as I'm suggesting, I don't think we will ever be unified as a people, because inherently, in people's DNA is selfishness, and they always want to believe that they are superior to somebody else, even within our own families, right? Who, the person who is most educated, the person who has more money, we always want to think that somehow we are the superior to the other, right? And that is what we believe. Now, we have the Acatarian is saying here, leave the Americans' plights out of the equation for your reparations for the United States of Africa. The United Nations even concluded the Americans are far removed from Africa up to 600 years now. Well, the fact that they're removed and the fact that they deserve reparations are two things, are two distinct conversations. You need to understand that. The fact that they, African Americans worked also and their labor was considered free labor, that they deserve reparations just as Caribbean people, right? So if Caribbean people should get reparations, African Americans also deserve to get it. Now, good afternoon, David Frater, everyone on this platform. Thank you so much for joining. And we are one big family. Now, the fact of the matter is, are we really one big family? And this is what we are here to discuss. Yes, I think that is the goal. That should be the goal. That should be the underlying goal, that we become one family. But unfortunately, we're not. Okay, unfortunately, we're not one big family. Then how can we, try to be one big family? That is where you and I now will have to discuss what can we do to ensure that we become united. But another thing we must understand, as Professor Rex Nutterford suggested, we must also appreciate our diversity. So if you are, a person, a child of a white parent and a black parent, you cannot deny that your white heritage. You can't deny your black heritage. And this is what we, the Caribbean, have done. We have taught Americans that we can be both at the same time. And don't just tell us because we have an inkling of black blood that you're black, or an inkling of white blood that means you're white. We can be both at the same time. We must learn to respect diversity and the differences, and understand that at the end of the day, we are all humans, and it takes humans to have, we all have the same thing, right? Blood, the red blood runs through our veins. Now we have WHD saying, do in Rome as the Romans do, is in the opposition to multiculturalism, right? And this is what we here, I understand what they mean by multiculturalism, but the essence of what they're trying to do, we realize that it is not accomplishing, because it's almost like they're telling us that we all have to live together. And in the same way in which we're seeing in the migration policies, and they're foisting people upon us, and that we have to live together with them. No, right? That is not how because it's also moving us back into the time of slavery, where we had these forced migration. That's what they're moving us, and say you have to live together. And that is not how we need to be, in a situation where we understand each other and understand each other's similarities and, in fact, our differences. Very important we understand that. Now, some people would have been asking, or some people say that Stuart Hall was anti-Pan-Africanism, because many people think that if you do not say you're black all the time and you're wearing dashikis and talking about Africa all the time, it means that you're anti-black. It's almost like a religion, right? People say, oh, I'm Christian, but what are you doing? The Bible says, by their fruits you shall know them. So people who are saying that they're Christians, show me that you're a Christian, don't tell me that you're one. Show me that you are Pan-Africanist, don't tell me that you are one. And the way how you show me is by living it. And oftentimes people who say that they're Pan-Africanist don't live it. They embrace all European things, right, at the same time, and even their demeanor is quite European. And this is where we now have to draw the line, right? Just too much cultic behavior by this, what we call Pan-Africanism. It's a secular religion in many, many aspects of it. Now, we're not saying that we should not be pro-Africa. All right, we should, but we should be pro-Africa in what we do. We can't be pro-Africa and then, invite Africans to come to the Caribbean to suffer, right? We should highlight to them that we have some problems here. Do you want to help us to solve these problems and to fix where we live? But to just say they're going to come and we're going to miraculously going to, enjoy economic wealth and economic growth, that is not being African in any sense of the word. Because, when you love somebody, you want to tell them the truth. Now, Stuart Hall was not anti-Pan-African or Pan-Africanist, but he was critical of some forms of Pan-Africanism, particularly when they treated African identity as fixed, essential, or uniform. Now, Stuart Hall, and he, 1932 to 2014, the Jamaican-born cultural theorist, viewed identity as something that is historically shaped and constantly evolving, and influenced by culture, politics, and migration. This perspective led him to question versions of Pan-Africanism that all people of African descent shared a single unchanging identity, which they don't. Because depending on the culture that they find themselves, there are similarities, but not always in cultural similarities. There are cultural similarities and there are cultural differences. Now, some of his key ideas include, in his influential essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora, that was published in 1990, Hall argued that there are two ways of thinking about cultural identity. One emphasizes a shared history and ancestry, which aligns with aspects of Pan-African thought. The other side sees identity as continuously formed through historical experiences, differences, and change. Hall found the second approach more compelling while recognizing the importance of the first. Hall stressed that the African diaspora is diverse, which we know. Even the African continent is itself diverse. Caribbean societies, for example, were shaped not only by African heritage, but also by indigenous peoples. European colonization, our colonialism, Asian migration, and Creole cultural development. He was skeptical of essentialism, the idea that there is a single authentic African identity that all Black people should embrace. He believed this could overlook important differences among African and diasporic communities. But when we look also, ladies and gentlemen, at Malcolm X, Malcolm X was a Muslim, right? And what happened when he went to Mecca? He realized that there were people, white people with blue eyes who were also Muslims. And that shocked him because he, based on what he had learned in the United States, he thought Muslims were Blacks and they were trying to liberate Black people from white people. But he realized that the Muslim religion, Islam, is a religion. It's not something that is set in stone. So you can have, Asians who might be Muslim, just like people would think that Rastafarianism, yes, it came from Jamaica, but there are other people who actually, align their philosophy to that religion, right? It does not necessarily mean that they're Jamaicans, or they might embrace everything that Rastafarianism embraces. And that's what we have to understand. That diversity is something that is not set in stone. And so we can't say we're all just Black. What does that mean? Black and what? And even white people, what we call white people in the first place, when they describe themselves in America, they tend to link their lineage or their heritage to their ethnic background. Germans, Italians, French, whatever they are, Russians, and Europeans, sometimes they don't know the difference sometimes between one versus the other, right? Because sometimes we tend to be ethnocentric, and we have to be able to learn that these civilizations are distinctive. So when we look at the Asian continent, all right, sometimes we often mix up the Chinese with the Japanese, with the Vietnamese. They're not all the same. Right? They might have gone through some certain struggles too. They have been through their struggles of colonialism in the case of India, but can they say that they're all the same? No, right? Because it would not be true, right? We have distinctive cultures that we need to learn to embrace. So this is what we are here discussing this afternoon. Hall, nevertheless, acknowledged the importance of Pan-Africanism as a political and intellectual movement that challenged racism, colonialism, and white supremacy. So we can have that because we all suffer from this. So this is one commonality that we can all embrace, that whether you're from Jamaica or you're from Trinidad or you're from Guyana, okay, once you are so-called of African descent, we are going to be at the bottom of society, or they want to place us at the bottom of the hierarchy. So in terms of political and intellectual movements and experiences, we can say, even though the experiences will differ from island to island, but we can say under that umbrella, we are under that system of racism, colonialism. We have all experienced that, and white supremacy. His critique was directed more at rigid conceptions of identity than at the movement's goals of solidarity and liberation. Given our interest in Caribbean identity, Hall's work is often contrasted with thinkers such as Marcus Garvey, who emphasized global Black unity rooted in Africa. Paul Gilroy, who's Black Atlantic, similarly argued that Black identities were formed through transatlantic movement and exchange rather than a single origin. C.L.R. James from Trinidad, who combined anti-colonial politics with an appreciation of the Caribbean's distinct historical developments. So when we're discussing something of this complex nature, we have to also read these people's works, because they did understand that we are not just, static, and we have this essential identity, as many of them are saying, particularly in the academy today, are suggesting that we're all Black. Now, Stuart Hall was not anti-Pan-African. So he supported Black solidarity and the anti-colonial struggle, but challenged versions of this Pan-Africanism that we find ourselves in. Now, as we move on, let us look at some clippings of what our Caribbean people are saying, and we can have the discussion quickly and perhaps end the chat. All right, so let me show some of the clippings that I've came up with, and we can discuss what some of these people are saying in light of the debate. Now, this Haitian, well, I think he's American of Haitian descent, is saying Haitians are not Africans, right? So let us listen to what he's saying here. I thought I had it on, it hasn't gone on the screen. Let me see what's there. Oh, I have to put it on the stage, okay?
Right? Haitians are not Africans. You can fight me whatever you want. We are not Africans, okay? We get the whole descent and ancestors and stuff. We separated ourselves from since when we fought the independence and none of y'all niggas jumped in, okay? We fought for y'all. We was the first to get our independence, okay? When 2B and all them people were still saying massa and stuff, we fought back. You feel me? So we need y'all to understand. Yes, we see the similarities. Yes, we see, yeah. We do voodoo. Voodoo came from Africa. Yeah, all that, yeah. You know what I'm saying? They're the pioneers and all that. We give it up to them when they do the voodoo. They do the voodoo first. But now we do the voodoo the best, to the point that we got our independency. Are you following? So when you say that, put some respect. We see the similarities, but we need y'all to respect the differences. Do you understand what I'm saying? Respect the differences. I don't go up to Asian niggas and go, you Chinese, and a nigga might be Japanese. We need y'all to understand, because some of y'all people don't care nothing about the Caribbeans, and y'all just say, oh yeah, you Jamaican, or you just African. No, we all are individuals that have our different identities, okay? So when you see a Jean, that is not an African. That's a Haitian. I need you to put the respect on it. There's a difference. You can't tell me Jean is African. Jean is, you know what's up.
Okay, somebody's saying that he doesn't agree with the guy about Haiti is not, Haitians are not Africans. Now, what do you think? David Frater is saying Haitians are in fact Africans. Now, is that true that Haitians are Africans in light of what we have discussing? What do you think? Do you think Haitians are Africans, or do you think they are the majority are of African descent, but culturally are Caribbean? What do you think? Let me hear from you. Are Haitians Africans? Yeah, are Haitians Africans? What do you think? Are Haitians Africans? Now, I could ask you, are Brazilians Portuguese? Are Brazilians Portuguese? No, they're not Portuguese, right? Even though the overwhelmingly, the Portuguese actually impacted their culture, but Brazilians are not Portuguese. But they are largely of Portuguese descent in the same way that they are largely of African descent, right? But they're not Portuguese, neither are they African. They are Brazilians, and the Brazilians coming together from different parts of the world to form essentially what that culture is. Are Americans, those who have British descent, British? No. If they go to Britain, British people don't recognize them as being British. Why? Because they're Americans. It's not the color of your skin that, as I'm suggesting to you again, you've got to get some of these things out of your head, that you look at somebody's color and think that they are similar to you. Russians, for example, do not see themselves in the same light as the Western Europeans, and vice versa. The Western Europeans don't consider Russia to be a part of their continent, even though it is, right? Because they culturally, religiously, they're different. Politically, they're different. And that is what you have to understand. We have now made the education system in the simplistic way of thinking that people don't understand that it's more complex than that. Human relationships are more complex. So I agree with him that what we can say is that Caribbean cultures, and including Haiti, is a synthesis of all of these cultures, where you have the indigenous, the Asians, right? We have Europeans, Africans, all having come together to form a Caribbean, a quintessential Caribbean, Haitian, Trinidadian, Jamaican, Barbadian identity. But we can't say that we are either one or the other. Why? Because several cultures came and they have influenced us, as Professor Rex Rutherford said. That is amalgamation of cultures that came together to form one distinct culture wherever we find ourselves. And that's why you have the Barbadian behaving differently from the Trinidadian behaving differently. Why don't you think we all celebrate Carnival? Because that's not the culture that, was inherited in Barbados. So Barbados doesn't have the same, Carnival culture as the Trinidadians have. And these are the things that we have to understand. But the education system and politics, because it's a political agenda, they want to force us into what they call this multicultural environment, forcing us to live together, even though, yes, we are even trying to live together. And as Professor Rex Rutherford said, that most of us are living side by side, but we're not living together. Okay? Are we going to live together one of these days? I hope so. But I don't know if in this life we're ever going to live together. Now let's go to another clipping as Nigerian living in Trinidad and his experience there in Trinidad.
From Nigeria, but I live in Trinidad and Tobago. Listen, the other day I went to the grocery store and I saw somebody that looks like my uncle, Uncle James. Uncle James passed away, and I saw this man. I could say this man is Uncle James. And I knew Uncle James is dead. So I walk up to him and said, my Uncle James. I was just joking, right? He started saying, no, my name is not James. I said, no, you look like my uncle, Uncle James. And he started laughing. So he and I eventually became friends. But I tell you this, Trinidadians, the Afro-Trinidad especially, looks like people from Nigeria and Ghana. Now, yes, you can surmise that. I studied in Trinidad. I did a course called Caribbean Thoughts and Culture, where I narrowed down cultural differences of different Caribbean countries. Though my research was more focused on Dominica, then I realized that Afro-Trinidadians came from Nigeria and Ghana, especially Nigeria, right? And we have a lot of people from the Igbo tribe who came during slavery to Trinidad and Tobago. That is why they look like us. I'm like, wow. Even when I came to Trinidad, I couldn't even tell I was out of Nigeria, because some of the cultural practices are very similar. The market, the way the market is organized, the way they sell stuff in the market, very similar to Nigerian style, right? And that is why when I came to Trinidad, I realized also that a lot of things we have in my tribe are here. Like some of the fruits that they have in Trinidad are also in my tribe. A lot of things that they have in Trinidad, the cassava, all of these things, we have that in my tribe. I said, wow, am I in Nigeria? What's happening here? But the thing is that I think based on research, when the slavery thing happened, the Africans who were brought to the Caribbean came with some of the cultural practices, some of the fruits and some of the things from Africa. That is why when you come to the Caribbean, you will see a lot of things that is exactly as what we have back in Africa. So So those who are asking me these questions about Trinidad and Nigeria, so I'm bringing a little clarity on reason why Trinidad is like Nigeria in some aspects, all right? But there are a lot of difference in terms of culture. Of course, we respect that, all right? God bless you. See you in the next video.
Right. So he's making the point and making a very solid and convincing case that when he traverses Trinidad, he goes to the market scene, right? And he sees, what's happening there. And he's suggesting that, lots of Black Trinidadians are from that part of Africa, from Nigeria, from Ghana and this area. Now, the fact of the matter is what he's saying is not lie, but there are other truths to it that we have to examine. And in the same way, when we move from one part of the diasporic realm, like from Jamaica to Brazil or to Trinidad, wherever, you see lots of cultural similarities among Black people. But at the same time, there are also cultural, differences that we have to be able to learn to acknowledge, and that we're all not the same, right? We're all not the same, even though there are inherent cultural similarities. And that is the beauty of humanity. That is what makes us complex. We are more than what people see, and often what people see is just giving a minute picture of really who we are and who we represent. And that's why we always have misunderstandings in terms of even our personalities. People see you and they make, inferences about you and, say you're this or you're that, and you're more than what they are seeing. So much of more than what they're seeing. Trevor is saying, peace, family. I'm actually surprised the chat isn't raging with a storm of information, etc. Yeah, well, I don't think that they're interested in these topics. It's more running to see what the next political theater and drama is about. But there's an article that somebody wrote here, guys, that I think that I want to share with you. And it says, the truth without fear or favor. And he's saying, Caribbean people, who are we really? He's asking that question, who are we really? And this was written yesterday, right? The Caribbean remains an interesting but complex area. It is not only a geographical region, but a people with a rich, varied, and individual island history. And as one historian notes, its people consist of communities within a nation. It should be surprising then that this complexity exists and remains firmly entrenched. This is the source of both its strengths and its challenges, which makes the idea of the Caribbean identity and the Caribbean people even more suspect. And the question of who we really are more urgent, indeed more difficult to answer. Professor Beckles, that's from Barbados, a Caribbean historian, states that the original Caribbean people were taken away by the Spaniards and Portuguese to various other islands to engage in mining and to work on plantations. Then came slavery, the plantation system, emancipation, and social unrest by the now freed persons to seek a better life. Political parties and political representation later emerged from this, and here began the formal construction of what would become independence and the transformation of Caribbean people into an electorate with direct say in how they would be governed. The journey then was from slavery to independence and the making of a Caribbean civilization. But whereas in the pre-independence period, Caribbean people were somewhat, in the post-independence era, our people became more nationalistic, as we're seeing right now, self-centered, even more belittling and prejudicial of others with similar cultures and history. So while we were under slavery and colonialism, we were more unified. The same thing is happening in Black America now too. Black Americans were more united when they were segregated in the United States. After integration, they became individualistic and they look down on each other because they are now divided into classes, those who are more educated than the other, and hence you don't have a unified Black American culture. Even though they're suggesting that they do, they don't, just like we have here among Caribbean islands. Instead of seeing ourselves collectively as Caribbean people, we began to describe ourselves selectively based on our country of birth. Anyone not like us and not being locally born was regarded as a foreigner. The new institutions that were created to reflect regional unity further separated us instead, like CARICOM. So CARICOM is not unifying us in any stretch of the imagination, by any stretch of the imagination. And those countries are not independent, even though admitted were seen as second class. Even in economic terms and population-wise, the non-independent Caribbean islands were looked on and still are regarded as people from the small islands, which implied a lack, even though the economies of many of these countries performed qualitatively better than many of the independent others, and still do. And most interesting, even presently, when students from non-independent Caribbean territories attend higher educational institutions in bigger island countries, they are often told by fellow students that they are occupying space that belongs to local persons. They are also asked why their own countries cannot build equivalent institutions to accommodate their own indigenous students. The question then stands more firmly: who are we? And what kind of people are we? Internally and domestically, Caribbean people are divided still with respect to race, class, economic status, and there are differences in cultural practices. We feel like foreigners when we travel to each other's country. Our accents are different, our behavior lies between extremes, and in many instances, we do not understand each other when we speak. Some island people tend to think their people are more intelligent and better at performing certain tasks, and also learn quicker than those from other Caribbean territories. What is even more frightening is that the people from one of our non-English speaking Caribbean territory claim they are superior to everyone, even though the population is predominantly Black. So what we have here is a complex and complicated situation existing within each island and between the people of each territory. Nothing appears to have a sense of unity or predictability. And what should describe us as being Caribbean people is yet to be determined. We don't know. We say we are one, but we don't even know what we mean when we say we are Caribbean. Even in the political realm, those Caribbean countries that have become republics psychologically think that they are at a better or more politically advantaged stage, or advanced stage, I should say, than those that remain at the level of independence, although no greater political or economic advantages or enhanced status with respect to the developed countries can be seen to have resulted from this move. Rather, pride, the need to create false expectations among their constituents, and the game of wanting always to be ahead of others seem more likely to be at play here. The question still remains to be posed: who are we really as Caribbean people? We are not multiracial or multicultural, since these terms suggest unity and being one people, and there are various divisions here based on race, class, cultural heritage, and economic well-being. When Professor Beckles suggests Caribbean people are communities within a nation, is he almost right or dead wrong? That is something to read and to listen to. The fact that we are communities living side by side, but we are not working together. Oh, that is the truth. But our intellectuals like to give us the understanding, they like to give us the illusion that we're one Caribbean. In the same way that in the African American community, they like to behave as if they're one Black community, but they're not, right? During slavery and segregation, they were, because they were just Black. But now that they are in different classes, different social and economic classes, they are not. And they also don't want to confront that reality. Okay, and that's why life there is not improving for them. And life here is not improving for us because we don't want to confront the realities, and we have intellectualized everything we do. And the school system is no longer telling us the truth. Trevor is saying the answer to who we are comes from our heritage before our history, which is We are just slaves, and we're slaves. We are not, or we're just slaves, and we're slaves from Africa. Trace the people back from the transatlantic trade and the slave coast. And we just said that there's a difference between ancestry and, nationalism and also culture. All of these things, terminologies we explored at the beginning of the conversation. Jahiler or Hilaire, I am Caribbean indigenous to the Americas. Love that. Okay, love that. Um, so we have here that Trevor saying once you get there, trace back who were doing the selling and who were sold and where they were taken from as the Europeans conspired with another people who looked like us but not us, sold us. Now, one of the things I've been asking is that are we living in the past? Are Black people, so-called, living in the past? I too, I'm sure some of you are in your 40s, your 30s. I said before, you want to go back to the days of the 70s and the 80s, or the 80s and the 90s, because you thought that that was a better period, right? And the economy was probably better, or, just living. People were better. There were more communities. But can we go back to the past? Or do we have to confront the realities, the current realities that we have been transformed into, that we have morphed into, that we have transitioned into, and begin to build from here? And what I find about so-called Black people, that we're living in the past. We're still talking about Africa and what Africa used to be kings and queens. And it's almost like we have lost memory of Africa. At this stage, we have lost memory of Africa. So how do we even know that we were kings and queens? Or are we just hearing these speculative, scholarships, and we say it's true because it builds our self-esteem and our egos? We have to live in reality, ladies and gentlemen, and we are not living in reality. And that is why we are not going to move on. Because if I'm living in the 1970s and I can reminisce of life in the 70s. Nothing is wrong with that. I can reminisce about life in the 70s. But I should not think that life in the 70s are going to remain with us, or is going to remain with us, because that we have moved on. And we are in 2026. But oh yes, how we long for the days of the 1970s and the 1990s. Okay, don't we? Yes, but will those days come back? No, they're gone. They're gone, and we have to move on now with the lives that we have. One set of people were put into slavery. Saving Black and African are just blanketed terms to keep you in the dark. Absolutely. And then we have, be careful with the nationalism. By that same term, we could be Greek even though we are not, American even though we are not. Our identity was stripped for a reason. Yes, but even though our identities were stripped, we formed another identity because we came upon another reality that we had to, adapt to. And that is exactly what we did. So that reality became Trinidadian or Barbadian or Guyanese or Jamaican or Antiguan. That is a new reality that we have formed, or if you call it Caribbean. Okay, that is our new identity that we have formed based on the experiences that we came upon in the region. Who else from any other part of the world on any continent is called just white or Chinese? Right. It's just vague. Right. And I was saying that white people, use that terminology because it's used to give them privilege. But at the same time, they know that that is not their identity. And that is why often they harp back to the fact that they are Irish or they're Italians or they're Spanish or they're Dutch or whatever, because that is what separates them and gives them a sense of identity. And that is why many Black people in the region lack identity, lack self-esteem, because we want to just say we're Black, and that does not mean anything. Right? Absolutely nothing. Let's explore other videos before we end the chat, before we end the live, and look at other, perspectives given by other people. Caribbeans and African communities are one. We're seeing this lady saying here. Let me get this on the screen, and then we'll discuss this as well.
They want to be, but I do feel like you say maybe you're Caribbean or maybe I'm African American. I think that's actually you upholding kind of what the slave masters done to us. You are encouraging what they did to us, because what they did is they took us and then divide us and disperse us and said, okay, no, these are not going to be Africans anymore. These are Caribbeans. These are African Americans.
They stripped us
They
of
stripped
our
our
identity.
identity, and I feel like
Absolutely, yeah.
you are encouraging that. You are like affirming what they did to us. Our trauma is what you want to wear as a badge of honor, when it should be like, yeah, I'm Caribbean, but you know what, my roots, I want to find out my roots, my ancestors, the people that fought for us, the people, do you know what I mean, like our excellence. Because like Africans, it's not always about slavery. We had empires. Mansa Musa, we had so much beauty in being African, and I feel like for you not to want to find out, I just feel like you are really encouraging white supremacy. Personally, that's just my opinion. But again, anybody can do whatever. You can stand for whatever you want to stand for. Even though some people can decide if they want to be Caribbeans or Africans, I think we're all Africans.
Of course,
We all come from the motherland.
I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry to say, but we all come from the motherland.
Do you know what I mean? Like I don't. I feel like even the African Americans, like, oh, they say they're not African. I'm like, girl, you are all African. We all came from the motherland.
Now, again, the simplistic narrative of we are all Africans, right? And are we all Africans? No. All right. We can't, that is how, but ancestrally, yeah, we are. Our ancestors largely came from Africa. So that is what we have to distinguish between our ancestry and our culture, right? Because the two can be true at the same time. That by our ancestor, and sometimes we can't even say we are fully African by ancestor too, because we have other ancestors within the region. So a person who looks like me can have ancestry, indigenous ancestry, can have European ancestry at the same time going on, and that's why we can't fully. But we can say, by large, that most of our ancestors did come from Africa and should be proud of saying that. But we can't say that we are this entirely thing. We're Black, and that's where it ends. And that is why, in the United States, people are so confused, because they divide themselves. And even now we're studying that some so-called white Americans, lots of them, particularly in the South, have Black blood. So they are confused likewise, because there is no pure race, as they're suggesting. The race is a social construct. It is not a natural phenomenon. Okay, and we have been saying this on this channel from the beginning, right? From the beginning, we have been saying that race is a social construct. It is not a natural phenomenon. Your correct answer, our identity was stripped. And that is why we are easily shaped now, but no other people forget their heritage but us. We love Japanese culture, etc. They preserve it, not replace it. Right. The thing about it is that we love the part of African culture that we want to embrace. So whenever we want to behave badly, all right, whenever we want to, have these lewd lyrics in the dance hall and the hip hop and all of that stuff, we claim that we're Africans, right? So all of the things that are not going to build us, all the values that will not build us, that is what so-called Black people claim and are proud of. Proud to speak Ebonics and proud to speak Jamaican Creole. Anything that does not make us productive, right? That is what we claim, and we proudly do it. And that's why we're never going to succeed and to be able to rise above the other ethnic groups, because anything that is antisocial, anti-mainstream, oh, it's African behavior, we have to, remember we're Africans and we have to behave like that. Okay? And that is the point. That's the truth, and it's sad. Now, Trevor's saying that's why today we have two types of Black people being sold to your mind. Be an educated sellout, correct, in the lodge and have titles in that class, or be an uneducated lesser class who sells out via selling lies. And the underclass is what represents the authentic Black culture, as it were, right? Because if you're behaving otherwise, then you're behaving white. You're speaky spokey, you're too, whatever you are. Now, the real world classifies people by tribe, not color, nor region, or religion, or region, right? Yeah, you're correct. You're correct. 100% correct. Interesting, she mentioned Mansa Musa. The same people who are or empire, which he took over, who then reclaimed their land, were the ones who were taken into the slave trade to be sold. How many know that? Yeah, you're correct. You're correct here. And one of the things that we have to understand is that, people, even in their tribes, oftentimes have their selfish, goals, objectives, and are not unified as we think they are. People in the same religion are often not unified in the same way we think they are. So how is it people who share the same land space, who are Jamaicans or Trinidadians, are not unified in the same way we think they are? So how is it that we think we have this unified Black culture? And what does that mean? What does that mean? Or people can afford to be optimized slaves now because we find joy in being the blueprint that white supremacy made for us, or made us to follow. Because let me go back there because I've jumped this. Yeah, the blueprint, the things are coming in that white supremacy made for us to follow. Always victims of it because we abide by the racist ideals, correct? And then we have pro-Black, this Black, that Black. Go and tell a Chinese he is Korean. Absolutely, that is what they do. They will never accept that, or a Japanese per se. The latter type of Black people sell death to their people, lies like Tyler Perry and death music, drug dealers. That is what we claim right now. Hip hop in the most despicable way, dance hall in the most despicable way. Those are the things that we claim to be inherently African, and that is why people look down on African culture, because we sell them that sort of culture. In fact, as you said that, Trevor, there was a video recently I watched in which this American went to Jamaica and was showcasing the typical commercialized Jamaica, right, of Rastafarianism and downtown music and all of that. And a number of Jamaicans were asking her, why can't you show that Jamaica has a university and show that it has academic, or has universities, has an intellectual side to it, right? What they promote generally is the party and the music and that, because that is what Black culture and Blackness is all about. That is what we're all about, and we don't care, and then we wonder why we're not doing well. Now, yes, we are one people ethnically. We have only diverged slightly culturally during the past 400 years. Ethnically, we're not also one, okay? Because when you look at the mixtures of Black people, right? You go to Brazil, you go to the Dominican Republic, and you go to other countries, to Trinidad, and all over the Caribbean and Latin America, you're going to see Black people mixed with other ethnic groups. When I was in Brazil, you would see a lot of Black people mixed with the indigenous peoples there in Brazil, and it's almost giving a different sort of ethnicity when you look at them, right? So ethnically, we're also not the same, right? So that's what, but ancestor-wise, yes, we are. We have common ancestors. Black culture, what? Nonsense. An African doesn't even refer to his culture as a general Black culture. Correct. They don't know what Black culture is. The Africans don't. I'm happy you're making this point, because they too are saying that they don't know what Black culture is. What is Blackness? They never even thought of themselves to be Black before they went to Great Britain and the United States, because that is what people define people of African descent, or African descended, as Black people. And and before, I want to read you something too, where this writer was suggesting that it was only in the 1960s that Caribbean people started calling themselves Afro-Caribbean. They never called themselves Afro-Caribbean before, right? They just were Jamaicans, or they were Trinidadians. But the whole matter of the culture coming from the United States and the Black power, and nothing is wrong with some of the things that the Black power told us, and it energized us. Black is beauty. You can have your women, you can have your natural hair, and everything like that. Nothing is wrong with that. It's the extent to which we have taken it. And to some extent, we have not benefited from it because we have not become more productive. And in some cases, we moved away from educating ourselves, thinking that Blackness is synonymous to progress. And just by being black, it means therefore that we control the world because African civilization, we were kings and queens and we're living in the past and we're not living in the present world. Okay, and that is what we need to understand. But there was an article here, Tough Conversations. She calls it Tough Convos. What is the difference between Black American or Black African and Black Caribbean? And for members of the Black community, defining racial identity can be a complex, highly personal, and nuanced process. On the surface, I'm wondering why this is here. I'm not seeing what. Yeah, okay. There's something here that is blocking my vision, and I can't. It's really. Let me see if I can make the screen. Yeah. Okay, let me see if it's there. Oh yeah, I'm reading better now. Okay, so let me go back because this was blocking. Examples of more specific terminologies include the ones used to refer to the ethnic origins of certain African Americans and Black Canadians, such as Ethiopian American or Antiguan Canadian. Here we recognize that just as there are different shades of Black, every Black person has a unique blend of experiences, culture, and ancestry. This is the same Black person with the same ancestor like yourself can be mixed. Can be mixed. For this Africa Day, May 25th, we're focused specifically on answering the question, what is the difference between Black African and Black Caribbean? A Black African is a Black person of African ancestry who is a native or inhabitant of a country in the African continent, or a first-generation immigrant. Meanwhile, a Black Caribbean, also called Afro-Caribbean or African Caribbean, is a descendant of Africans, the majority of whom were transported as slaves between the 15th and 19th centuries to the colonial Caribbean through the transatlantic slave trade. These people were made to labor largely on sugar plantations and provide domestic help. Afro-Caribbean is not a term the Black Caribbean people chose for themselves, but was a term introduced in the late 1960s by European Americans. So it was European Americans who foisted this terminology of African Caribbean upon us. They're the ones who also foisted upon us nigger, and people tend to use that. Black people are using that word. They use it ad nauseum, right? Black, nigger, every day, what's up, nigger? And who called you that? Whites. So whenever you're talking about Pan-Africanism, and even some of these Pan-Africanists and those who believe in Pan-Africanism, they speak like that too, right? Calling themselves the same foolish name and, denigrating name. A denigrating name used by white people. So when we talk about these, blackness and all of that stuff, what do we really mean? I didn't finish your thing where you have here that Black culture, and then we see one they call Black culture is death and degeneracy. That's what we call Black culture is degeneracy. That's what we mean when we say we're Blacks. Brazil and Chile, etc. What happened in the Spanish Inquisition? We need to wake to hell. We need to wake to hell up and stop claiming what is not ours. Yes, I think much of what we understand as scholarship came from the white universities. And that is what we're doing. We don't understand that this is has nothing to do with Black culture, but we have simply because they want to see us down. They want to see us, in a very divisive manner. And as a result of that, they make us think that we are intellectuals when we are not. We're suffering and have an abandonment syndrome and Stockholm syndrome. We need to do our research and stop wanting to be spoon-fed by his story. Correct. Very well said. And all of this so-called higher educated Black talk is just egotistical masturbation, wanting to be a Pan-African, which only serves their new colonial defeat. And he is right. Trevor is right. When you go to these departments, I've seen them, used to work with many of them, right? And all of this African talk and you look at their lives, has nothing to do with Africa. But it sounds nice. And for the students who are not so much educated and sophisticated, they drink it like a Kool-Aid, right? And think that that is what is going to give them some amount of ego. It's more egotistical, as Trevor is saying. It fills the void. But we have to deal with the realities of who we are as a people. And it does not mean that we are going to negate that or we came from Africa. In the same way, if you grew up poor, it doesn't mean, therefore, that now that you're wealthy, that you are going to deny that. But people, there are people who will see you as now a rich person or somebody who can afford life, right? And they will think that you are the same, you should behave the same way as when you were poor, right? And if you're not behaving that way, oh, you're proud, and you should. The same way if you're educated and the person who knew you when you were not as educated, oh, you're proud, right? You can learn. Okay, we should not go and lower standards to suit people. We should lift them up. Life is about elevating the conversation, elevating your standard of living. It's not about you can go back and you can lift the person up. But the whole matter of blackness, and that you have to wear the sheikhs and you have to do, have all these symbolisms to be black, right, is something that we need to stop. Something that we need to stop, because people don't respect that. They're laughing at us. Because where are the economists? Where are the economies? Where are we meeting with each other to say we are uniting to build economies? Okay? You can't just be that we're just black because of a color, and that is what unites us, and suffering unites us, and the slavery unites us, and colonialism. We've got to wake up as a people, and we don't want to wake up because we like to listen to ignorance and stupidity. And that is what it's all about. Now, Trevor is saying, yes, Andrew, we are taught. So a black is a new being or creation as a result of a slave, which is clean canvas to be painted in the image of your oppressor. And by the way, don't you see how we tend to look at white people as Satans and devilish and all of that stuff? At the same time, our politicians who look like us are behaving the same way that they behave, and sometimes worse. Our politicians and our black leaders are behaving worse than our slave masters and our colonial masters. Okay? And they have been here for generations now, right? And they're doing the same thing, and we don't hold them to standards because they're black. Obama was in office. Obama is black, so he did a lot of the things that Trump is doing now behind the scenes, but he's black. He's black, right? Our standards are low. Our standards are low, and we must hold the same standards as we hold to white people to black people. And that's what we're here to discuss in this afternoon's program. Good evening, Maria. It might be a little bit late. I think that I've exhausted the topic now. If you have more comments in terms of your sharing, our Caribbean and African people, one people, race, identity, and history. And we're suggesting that they are not. But you might say that, yes, we are, right? But I don't think culturally we are not. Okay, we're not. And nothing is wrong with that. The same way that Black Americans are culturally not Caribbeans and vice versa. Nothing is wrong with that. And the same thing, Latin America, culturally are not similar. There are some similarities and there are also differences. And if we are going to become successful, we must accept both differences and similarities. All right. So that's the topic this afternoon. Many of you came late. I told you to come at 5. I think I'm going to end it here. You can look at the replay and we'll talk in another conversation. Have a great evening and see you another time. Ciao.